The kings of England had rather different reigns over their nation. One lost his head being a victim of his own tyranny in front of his own people. One is best remembered for the fact he had 6 wives, and another was so useless that his own barons tried to limit his power to stop him. But one thing that is not as well known is that some of the kings of England did have incredibly harrowing and brutal deaths, succumbing to terrible diseases that rampaged throughout their bodies and led to them having incredibly painful and suffering final days. In this documentary, we look at the deaths of many of these kings who did rule over England with varying success. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
John was born around Christmas in 1166 in Oxford, and he was the youngest and favourite son of King Henry II. When his father passed away in 1189, his brother Richard became the King of England and King Richard I. John was given gifts of land, titles and money following his father's death. However, Richard in 1190 regarded his nephew Arthur as the heir to the throne. Richard I was imprisoned in Germany in 1193, and during this John tried to take control of the throne of England, but he failed to do so, and when Richard returned the following year, John was banished from the country. The two brothers did make up, and when Arthur was captured and taken prisoner, John was made the heir to Richard's throne. In 1199, Richard passed away, and then John became the king. War with France continued and began again, which was triggered by John's second marriage to Isabella, the Countess of Angoulême. She had already been engaged to a prominent French noble, and the marriage threatened the interests of the French royal family. John treated these with contempt, and this resulted in an uprising that was crushed initially by John, but war did break out. By 1206, John had lost Normandy, Anjou, and other important parts of France, and these failures led to many to question his suitability to rule in England. It damaged his reputation massively, and John was determined to win these back, but in order to do so, he needed a large amount of money to continue to go to war with France. For this, he began to impose rather harsh taxes, and his government were ruthless in obtaining them, which caused a rather big problem with his popularity. People in England did not like paying extra tax, and many of them could not afford to do so. But in England, the barons who presided over large amounts of land were incredibly unhappy with John and his new taxes. John exploited his power and rights to take as much as he wanted, and the barons were furious. Eventually they went to war with the monarchy, and when the rebel barons took many different strategic castles and sites, the barons even invited the French king to England to help them take the fight to John and lead them, and it was said that the French king did have a claim to the throne. In 1215, John was forced to negotiate with the rebels when they seized London, and on the 19th of June 1215 he accepted the terms put forward by the barons and was forced to sign Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, that limited his powers and ensured that the king was not above the law. It was the first formal document stating that the monarch was under the rule of the country as much as his people were, and that the rights of individuals were to be upheld, even if the king did not like this. This settlement was deemed impractical, as John claimed that it was signed under duress, and the Pope took his side, and King John then laid waste and rampaged through the northern counties and the Scottish border region. When Louis of France did invade, John continued to fight the barons, but in October 1216, everything changed for the much reviled and hated King of England. In October 1216, John was travelling across England with a number of his followers, and he stopped to rest at an abbey of Swineshead in the Lincolnshire Fens. In the treacherous fens, he had lost half his baggage, and when he arrived, the residents of the abbey quickly scrambled to find food and accommodation fit for the king. It's believed that John may have even lost the English crown jewels in his travels at the time, and it's suggested that some of these even fell into the wash when he crossed the water. Some rumours have emerged about what occurred inside of the abbey. One is that inside of the house, John was poisoned by the monks, who found the king to be very arrogant. It was believed that the abbot did not want to host John, and that the king's reputation for cruelty and spite and even murder did not sit well with the monastic order. John ate their food and drank with the monks, and one allegation is that John was poisoned by the monks with poison that had been extracted from toads, and this was considered deadly. But at some point the king did leave the abbey, and it's not entirely confirmed what emerged from the visit, and he continued on to Newark Castle a short while away. It's believed that John met his end near or very close to a toilet inside of Newark Castle in October 1216. It's mostly believed that King John died from dysentery, a disease and illness that causes serious diarrhoea and eventually death. It was believed that John had been ill for quite some time before he came to settle in Newark. The rumours state that he could have been poisoned, or that it was brought down by eating unripe peaches which poisoned him and made him very sick, or also that he could have drank too much sweet ale, which also made him ill. It was said, to say John died of overindulgence was a way of criticising his personality. It implies intemperance, gluttony and imprudence. To say he was poisoned shows he was hated. Whatever the truth, those writing down history had nothing good to say about John. Dysentery is caused by parasites in the gut, and is most commonly spread by consuming dirty water or food that has been contaminated with human waste. It was not necessarily a condition of the common people, who lived in unsanitary conditions, as lots of food and vegetables had been grown in soil which was fertilised by human waste. It's likely that the king, who had been marching across the country and was most probably physically exhausted and emotionally exhausted, succumbed to his fate from dysentery. It was a condition that could affect anyone. For example, Edward I died from it as he went to renew his war with Robert the Bruce in 1307, and it could have also caused the death of Edward the Black Prince. Dysentery also killed the hero of Agincourt, Henry V, whilst he was fighting away in France. John was regarded as a cruel king, who punished his people and made their lives rather miserable, but today dysentery still kills many around the world, as sewer systems and water systems are not very advanced. He died on the 19th of October, 1216. It's likely that it was inside the gatehouse of Newark Castle, or in a room that was fitted with a functioning toilet following having a feast at the castle. Following John's death, his body was taken south by a group of mercenaries, where he was buried inside of Worcester Cathedral. There is some debate as to what caused his death. Was it drinking dirty water, or eating vegetables contaminated with human waste, or was it due to overeating? There is a tradition that John died from eating too many peaches, or that he was in fact poisoned by monks or other people who wished to end his notorious reign. John has been described as being distasteful and even dangerous, and spiteful and cruel. From this, John remains a very controversial figure in history, with most people considering that he was in fact the very worst king that England ever had. The fact he went to war with the barons and was forced to sign a charter that limited his power and ensured he was not above the people with regards to the law signifies what a truly terrible king he really was.
Edward I was born in June 1239 inside the Palace of Westminster, and he was the son of King Henry III and his wife Eleanor of Provence. His father named him after Edward the Confessor, but when he was a young man his health was not the best, and he suffered with a number of serious illnesses, and it looked at one point as if the young prince would not live. However, he did reach adulthood, and he was known for his height, in which he stood at 6 feet 2 inches tall, and for this was known as Edward Longshanks. When he was 14, his father married him to Eleanor of Castile, and the thought behind this was to prevent an invasion by the Castilian family in southwestern France, which was an English province. On the 1st of November 1254, Edward married Eleanor, and this marriage produced 16 children, but 5 daughters and a son would only reach adulthood. But when he was young, he was influenced by his uncles, and he was hated by a number of members of the English aristocracy, and he was involved with Simon de Montfort, a leader of a group of rebellious barons who opposed the rule of Henry III, Edward's father. But Edward continued to voice his opinion, and he became rather rebellious towards his father, and he pledged his full support to the leader of the rebels, Simon de Montfort. His father, the king, believed he was planning a coup, and to try and dethrone him, but the pair later reconciled. During the Second Barons' War, Edward sided with his father to defend the crown, and he went on the attack and launched a military campaign against the rebel barons, and this resulted in the death of de Montfort. But Edward then got involved in the Ninth Crusade, the last major crusade to the Holy Land, and this conflict was rather short and disastrous, and with this Edward, while he was in Sicily, was told that his father had died. Edward I was then proclaimed King of England, and he was then crowned as the king on the 19th of August 1274. During his reign he made a number of significant changes to the way he governed his kingdom, and he was a commander of the military, a religious man, but also someone who was seen as a skilled administrator. He made many changes to the law, and during his reign English Parliament met many times, and this was the foundations of government that is around today. He called his first Parliament in 1275, and this included members of the church and the nobility, along with the election of 2 county representatives, and this was known as Model Parliament. He managed to raise necessary funds through taxation, but he continued to war with other nations. Edward I dealt with Wales, and in opposition to a number of small uprisings in Wales, he launched a full-blown assault and military campaign in which he would conquest. He invaded in 1277 and defeated the Welsh rebel leader, and then rampaged to the west and built many castles to show his royal power. But Edward ordered any rebellious actions to be put down brutally, and with this terrible acts of violence were committed, and the country was then seen as a vassal state to England, and many of Edward I's castles still exist today. He also dealt with uprisings in Scotland, and in 1290 he was recognised as a Scottish overlord, and he then decided who would succeed to the Scottish throne. Edward chose John Balliol, and he was seen as a puppet who the English king could control, and when Edward invaded Scotland, he had Balliol imprisoned inside the Tower of London. But Edward I, because of his campaigns in Scotland, became known as the Hammer of the Scots, as he was very ruthless, and he continued to campaign and wage war against the Scots. But inside of his kingdom he did order the expulsion of the Jews, which saw Edward seize the property of those kicked out of his nation. But in 1306 it was noted that inside the king's household accounts that a lot of medicine, ointments, and other pieces of clothing were ordered as the king was suffering. The king's legs were treated by doctors, and he even at times wore a neck brace, and he suffered from painful joints. To combat this, Edward took herbal baths, and he consumed medicinal remedies, some which even contained gold, silver, and pearl. But Edward's health continued to decline in his final years, but he refused to die, and he went on one final Scottish campaign. In his final years he continued to wage war against the Scots, and continued to be ruthless. He brutally imprisoned Robert the Bruce's sister in a cage, and also executed his brother, who was hanged, drawn and quartered. In February 1307, Edward then began to gather his men, and he rallied himself as he moved north. Edward I continued to execute leading Scottish nobles, for example the Earl of Atholl, who was executed on a large gallows built specifically for the occasion. But when he rode out to Carlisle on the 3rd of July 1307, Edward I contracted dysentery, and on the 6th of July they reached Berg by Sands, which was on the English side of the northern border. But the following day the king's servants entered his tent to try and rally the king, as they lifted him from his bed, and Edward fell dead into their arms. News of Edward's death was kept secret to prevent desertion, and of course he was a very old man at the time, and Edward II was then crowned Edward's son. Edward I's body was sent south, and it arrived at Waltham Abbey in Essex, and here it lay in state, and a number of vigils were held for the king, and much prayer was said for his soul. There were preparations made for the funeral, and his body was then eventually moved to St. Paul's, before it was then moved to Westminster Abbey for the funeral. The king was laid to rest during this in his coronation robes, which included a red silk tunic and a cloth of gold lower garment, and a crown was placed on his head as was tradition, and in his hands his sceptres of royal office were placed. Edward I was then interred in a plain black Purbeck marble tomb, and there was no effigy placed on top of it, and the words "Edward the First Hammer of the Scots is here" was later added. But Edward's tomb was so plain, and some have even speculated that this may have been done to save money, or that Edward II may have been pleased that his father had died. But another possibility is that Edward I had wished for his body to not remain in a tomb for long, as he actually wanted his body to be allegedly boiled down, and his bones then taken to the Holy Land on crusade as a relic. The tomb of Edward I was opened on the 2nd of May 1774 by the Dean of Westminster, and his body was said to have been perfectly preserved, and his dried skin was visible, and it was confirmed that he was 6 foot 2 inches tall. But due to the coolness of the air and low humidity inside of Westminster Abbey, he had been well preserved. It was said of the king's body that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard, and a sinking or dip between the chin and the under lip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on the part of the bridge of the nose, which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possible fleshy part of the eyeballs, was movable in their sockets under the envelope. Edward I was a king of England for over 35 years, and inside of his kingdom he was very well respected, but he was a man who waged serious war against his enemies, including the Welsh and the Scottish, securing English power across Britain. But he was a ruthless and brutal man who ordered significant executions of prominent Scottish nobles and commanders such as William Wallace, and he would spare no dissent. Edward I, because of this, is considered one of the strongest, if not the strongest, English medieval king.
Edward II was a son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. His father is considered today a successful but brutal military leader who is linked to expanding castles and winning many battles. Edward II himself was born inside the walls of Carnarvon Castle, as the decision for this to occur was a conscious one, with the fact Edward I wanted to bring together Wales and England, as he had conquered large parts of it. Edward II became king, following his father's death, on the 7th of July 1307. One of his first commands was to recall Piers Gaveston to his court, a man who it's been rumoured to have been his lover. The next year, Edward II married the 12-year-old Isabella of France, despite the large age gap, with Edward being 23. Their marriage was an attempt to relieve tension between England and France, and they had 4 children, but Edward often left the Queen feeling neglected while spending time with his favourites. Piers Gaveston in particular was showered with gifts and titles, and he began to insult many of England's barons, calling the Earl of Warwick the Black Hound of Arden. However, the hound would eventually come back to bite him. Edward and Piers' relationship was described as a sin against nature and a love beyond the love of women, and it's thought that the king loved him. Gaveston later was captured after he fled for his safety, and he was located at Scarborough Castle. A number of barons captured him, and they tried to force the king to agree to the barons' demands, and Gaveston was held at Warwick Castle and was then sentenced to death. In nearby woodland, he was then beheaded by sword. Edward was seen as weak, and this was noticed by Robert the Bruce, the Scottish military leader. He had lost large amounts of his kingdom during Edward I's reign and wished to take it back. In 1314, Edward II and his army marched north to stop the Scots, but Robert had recaptured most of the castles taken by Edward previously, and had encroached into northern England. On the 23rd of June 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn erupted, and it resulted in a devastating loss for the English king. They were routed and chased by the Scots, with Edward II himself forced to run back. Despite his former friendship with Piers Gaveston, Edward also grew closer with another favourite, Hugh Despenser, who was given a large amount of land. This angered the nobles, and at times tensions between the French and English had also deteriorated. Isabella, Edward's wife, was sent to pay homage to her brother, the French king, but instead she plotted against her now hated English husband. She, along with her lover, Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, invaded England, and they wished to oust the king. Isabella even managed to capture and besiege a number of cities. However, Edward was captured, and he was forced to give up the throne. This left his 14-year-old son, Edward III, the King of England. During this revolt, Despenser was executed, being hanged, drawn and quartered, and he had Bible verses etched into his skin. His father was also executed and was then fed to some dogs. Edward II was then imprisoned inside Kenilworth Castle and was then moved to Berkeley Castle for his safety in early 1327. It was here that Edward was murdered, and he never left his cell once he was there. He was kept here as it was believed to have been more secure, but we don't really know how he was looked after. Castle records state that he was brought a number of luxury goods, but contemporary accounts claim he was treated poorly and was kept in terrible conditions. It was suggested that he was kept in a damp and dark dungeon and was left to stew in horrific conditions inside a dirty cell, with rotting animal carcasses sharing it too. It was hoped he would catch disease and die from these dead animals, rather than for him to be murdered in cold blood, with his prison guards being then held accountable for the death of a king. One thing is certain though, and it's that Edward II was killed or died inside of the castle. On the 23rd of September 1327, Edward III was told of his father's death a few days before in the evening of the 21st. Most historians accept that he did die on this date, but some believe it was later, but the circumstances of his death are slightly unclear. The most accepted and common story is that Edward II was murdered in cold blood on the orders of his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. It is believed that an assassin crept into his cell in the middle of the night and then murdered him, shoving a red-hot burning poker up his backside that slashed his entrails and caused catastrophic internal bleeding. It was said that the guards in the castle heard piercing screams coming from the king's chamber that evening, and that these screams were so loud that they were heard miles away. This rumour began in the 1330s, but there is no evidence to suggest it's true, and it could have just been propaganda. Another source claimed that Edward died at the castle, with no explanation as to how he died, and others claimed that he succumbed to natural causes. It's also debated whether he contracted an illness, but some accounts even claim he died of melancholy and sorrow inside of his cell. One bizarre account claims that he was murdered by a trick, or killed with suffocation and strangulation, or by violent means. Another even says how he was allegedly even freed from captivity, and that he managed to travel to Germany with his son the king, later meeting up with him in secret. The truth behind Edward II's death is that no one could be 100% sure what actually happened to him, but it's mostly accepted that he was murdered inside of the castle. In what manner he was killed remains a mystery today, and it's up to you whether you believe the red hot poker story or not. Maybe you actually think he escaped and fled to Europe. However, one day it's very possible that this medieval murder mystery will be put to bed with a solution. The murder of King Edward II still remains a shocking event in English history. Henry VI was the last Lancastrian to rule England. He was king twice from 1422 to 1461, and then for a year in 1470, before being kept off the throne for good. He was born on the 6th of December 1421 at Windsor Castle. His father was the valiant and brilliant King Henry V, the man who defeated the French spectacularly at Agincourt during the 100 Years' War. Henry VI was the youngest person, and still is, to ever come onto the throne and to succeed, but was officially crowned in 1429. He was even named the King of France in 1431, after his father's victories and successes in the 100 Years' War, but as was normal, he would not rule solely until he was old enough, and in the meantime a regency council oversaw the two nations. He married Margaret of Anjou in 1445, and was noted to have been a very religious man, but a king who put his faith in the wrong people and advisers. Power struggles often occurred at his court, and he found it incredibly difficult to oversee England, let alone rule over France too, and this stressful situation caused great strain on Henry. Things got worse with Joan of Arc's success and reputation causing significant damage to the English in France, and in 1450 Normandy was lost, which led to many in England to question their own king. Because of successive failings in France, the king was driven to a nervous breakdown, which occurred in 1453, and during this time, Richard the Duke of York was named the Protector of England. It took the king 2 years to recover, but during this time there had been a great divide emerge in the country. Civil war broke out in England, dividing the nation between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions. This saw the Protector, the Duke of York, fighting against the king, and in particular Henry's queen, who commanded the Lancastrian efforts. In 1460 the Duke of York was slain in the Battle of Wakefield, but then his son took up arms in the fight for the crown, and he heavily defeated Henry VI's forces at the Battle of Towton, which was described as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Edward then claimed the throne after the battle, and crowned himself King Edward IV. Henry VI fled and went into exile, but later returned a year later and was captured by Edward. During his capture he was then later paraded throughout London, with his feet tied to a horse, and he wore a straw hat proclaiming him to be a rebel. This caused great humiliation for the man who ruled over England for decades. But Henry would be returned to the throne, as at the turn of the 1470s, an incredibly powerful medieval noble would switch his alliance from York to Lancaster. The Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, switched, turning on the new king Edward IV. He was seen as the most powerful man in England, and the true power behind the Wars of the Roses. He then managed to restore Henry VI onto the throne in 1470, and Edward himself was forced into exile. He later returned a year later and laid waste to the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471. This battle in particular was noted for heavy losses of Henry VI's forces, and his only son was also killed. Edward the Prince of Wales was at one point the successor, but he was killed at the age of 17 on the battlefield. Edward IV, who then retook the crown, threw Henry into prison, sensing how dangerous it was having him around. He was thrown into not just a normal prison, he was imprisoned at the Tower of London, a place that today is synonymous with torture, execution, and brutality. The Tower, after all, is a place where 3 queens lost their heads, but what is less known is that it was a place where at least 1 king also died. It was said that when the royal party, presumably Edward IV, arrived in London, they were informed that Henry VI was dead. Official chronicles and documents from the time state how the deposed king passed away in the evening of the 21st of May, 1471. It's considered that Henry's enemies kept him alive for a while, as they feared his son more as a ruler, and it was favoured having the weaker Henry as the head of the Lancastrian forces, as he was doing more damage to his country, and his son would have been a better king. According to the history of the arrival of Edward IV, an official chronicle biased towards Edward, it was said that Henry VI died of pure displeasure and melancholy upon hearing the news of the Battle of Tewkesbury and his son's death. However, this can't be really believed, as sources close to Edward would not specifically say that Edward ordered the king's death or had Henry VI killed, as at the time kings were believed to have been sent by God to rule. If Edward had in fact ordered Henry's death, then he could have been seen to have offended God and to be nothing more than a murderous usurper. But the believed story of Henry VI's death and passing is much more brutal and savage than that. There have been a few people who have been blamed for the death of Henry VI, and one of them is the notorious King Richard III. Richard, who was the Duke of Gloucester at the time, has been blamed for the death of Henry. Sir Thomas More, the Tudor advisor to Henry VIII, stated Richard killed Henry, but it's believed that this was done as a way to portray Richard, the enemy of the Tudor dynasty, as a murderous and barbaric individual. It's believed though that Richard was away from London at the time of Henry's death, and also he was just 18 when he died. It's believed that Henry was murdered, and although in some accounts a specific murder is not named, it was said that Edward IV must have given the order for the death of his prized prisoner inside of the Tower of London. Having Henry VI alive ultimately was dangerous for Edward, and by ordering the death of him, he was extinguishing and exterminating the direct line of the House of Lancaster with ruthlessness. The belief about Henry VI's death is that on the night of the 21st of May 1471, on the night of the Vigil of the Ascension, Henry was praying inside his chapel in his prison. He was being held inside of the Wakefield Tower, one of the oldest parts of the Tower of London, which was built in the 13th century. Whilst on his knees praying, someone came up behind him and stabbed the former king to death, using a dagger or a sword. So whilst Henry VI was most vulnerable, an opportunistic assassin went up behind him, murdered him in cold blood, and ended the life of a man who had reigned over the country. Henry's body was originally buried inside of Chertsey Abbey, but his body was later moved to St George's Chapel inside Windsor Castle by Richard III. Allegedly, Henry's body was exhumed in 1910, and when the bones were analysed, it was said he was of 5 feet 9 inches tall. His light hair was also said to have been covered in blood, which is interesting as for over 400 years it remained preserved, and his skull had a significant amount of damage. This put beyond doubt rumours that the king simply died from melancholy, and in fact met a very bloody end. Henry VI's murder and death is considered a forgotten moment in English history, but he was a king born onto the throne. His reign is seen as a poisoned chalice, as Henry, being the king of France and England, could do nothing to juggle the thrones. He was plagued by poor judgment and by a civil war that split England and caused immense brutality and changed the face of history forever. His murderer has been lost to time, but what is certain is the fact he had a very violent death inside one of history's most famous prisons. Edward IV came onto the throne first in 1461, but in 1470 he was briefly deposed by Henry VI, the very man he kicked off the throne, and then he reigned again in 1471 to 1483. The Wars of the Roses led to the thrones shifting between Edward and Henry, and Edward had inherited his Yorkist claim to the throne from his father Richard, the Duke of York. Edward did defeat the Lancastrians heavily at the Battle of Towton, which was referred to as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, with up to 20,000 people being killed. He secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a Lancastrian knight, which upset his key ally, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. Edward did face rebellion during his time on the throne, and this in particular came from Warwick, who later turned against him, and his own brother George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence. George eventually was executed for treason, being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Edward's court was stated to have been one of the most splendid in the whole of Christendom, and he spent large sums of money on symbols, showing his wealth as the King of England. Much of his reign was well documented by historians, but his death still remains much of a mystery today. The king died around the 9th of April 1483 at the Palace of Westminster, and it's considered that his death was unexpected, and it took many by surprise. Edward IV was ill around the end of March, but despite having access to the best doctors and care, he did succumb to whatever it was that ended his life. His death was reported and minuted on the 9th of April, and it was said, Lord Audley and Lord Berkeley, now early this morning by the assent of the King's Council, sent unto the Mayor for to show and give knowledge that the King is passed out of his present life this last night. Before the sudden death of Edward IV, it was also been written that Edward was not suffering with ill health, but it was noted that the king had a strong appetite. It was said by an adviser he was wont to show himself to those who wished to watch him, and he seized any opportunity that the occasion offered of revealing his fine stature more protractedly and more evidently to onlookers. However, in food and drink he was most immoderate. It was his habit, so I have learned, to take an emetic for the delight of gorging his stomach. Once more, for this reason, he had grown fat in the loins, but he was a tall man, and very fat, though not to the point of deformity. Different sources do give different accounts of Edward, as another said how he was of visage lovely, of body mighty, strong and clean made, and he was of youth, greatly given by fleshly wantonness, from which health of the body, in great prosperity and fortune, without a special grace hardly refraineth. So with these we can establish that the king, despite being slightly overweight around the time he died, was not suffering with an ailment for too long. Different historians have debated Edward's true cause of death, and some believe that he was rumoured to be poisoned, but others also say that it was caused by a chill or a short illness, or even that the king died of sadness. It was also believed that Edward's death was brought on by the lifestyle he was living, a rather debaucherous one. There have been allegations that he was poisoned, and one historian believed he was poisoned with arsenic or some heavy metal. But from what we know about Edward's death, is that he took to his bed around Easter Sunday on the 20th of March 1483, and that within 10 days he was dead. However, from what we know about Edward's death, is that he took to his bed around Easter Sunday 1483, and that within 10 days he was dead. His passing was said to have taken the royal court by surprise, and after he died, his body was left naked for viewing, and this showed there was no violent end to King Edward IV, with no trauma or injury to his body. There were also no noted signs of disease, for example mumps, smallpox, measles, and even the bubonic plague, which would have left some signs on his body. Also, this ruled out other afflictions that were caused by bleeding under the skin, so he was not killed by leukemia or haemophilia. As the king also was noted to have been in good standing, it's unlikely that he died from a disease such as cancer that led to him wasting away, or undiagnosed diabetes. Also, it's interesting that a stroke or heart attack did not kill Edward, as the timescale of his illness denotes that there was not a sudden event that killed the king, neither was there a long drawn-out process and suffering that went on for months. Polydore Virgil states how Edward fell sick of an unknown disease, and another states how he died from a mix of sadness and a cold he caught whilst out fishing. An English chronicler wrote, however it was the melancholy and anger that he took with the French king, or were it by any other means, he suddenly fell sick, and was with a grievous malady taken, yes, so previously taken that his vital spirits began to fail and wax feeble. But none of this points towards a certain cause of death, and that is what the issue is around King Edward IV's death. So much of his story in the Wars of the Roses is recorded, but his final days were not, which further points to his death being a surprise. It's believed that as the king's health was beginning to fail, that he became subject to a number of different potions and ailments that were used by his doctors. This included emetics, which made him go to the toilet and also vomit, which then furthermore allowed Edward to feel empty in his stomach, and then it's believed he ate more and consumed more because of this. He would consume a large amount of food at royal banquets, and then throw up, and then go back to eat again, all of which was very dangerous. He was known for this before he fell fatally ill, but his cause of death remains a mystery. As mentioned, poison was believed to have been a possible cause, but this is most likely a theory that arose because of no obvious cause of death, and at the time this was attributed to deaths, especially of high-profile members of society, who had no signs before their shocking death. It's also been suggested that Edward died from malaria or pneumonia, but these diseases and symptoms of them have been around for centuries, and although treatments were not great, they could have easily been described. We have accounts of other royals and kings who passed away of illnesses decades and centuries before Edward, but this leads us to the contemporary account, from Edward's time, that his listed cause of death was apoplexy, which was brought on by excess and consuming food and drink to a huge amount. It was referred to as a sudden death that started with a lack of consciousness, in which the victim died after losing consciousness. It's what today would be classified as a stroke, or the rupturing of an internal organ. It's believed that Edward's lifestyle mixed with apoplexy could have been what killed him. It's clear that his health had been damaged by years of his debaucherous lifestyle, eating and drinking to excess, and as he gained a large amount of weight, it's believed this would have led to his downfall. Edward IV died at the age of 40, which was modest for a person living in the 15th century, but for a king it was still rather young. Following his death, his funeral cortege left passing Westminster Abbey, Sion Abbey, and it came to rest at Windsor Castle on the 19th of April. The chapel of St George he had commissioned to be built had not yet been finished, but the choir aisles had been roofed with timber, and the stalls were in place. Edward was brought to St George's Chapel to be buried, and the service was held, and he was buried in a tomb in the north choir aisle, and it was an elaborate burial complete with his jewelled sword and cap and his armour. These stayed until they were taken during the English Civil War. His tomb has been opened since, as on the 13th of March 1789, renovations were taking place at the chapel, and it was accidentally opened. A chamber contained the lead coffin of Edward IV, where his remains along with his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, were inside. It was noted that Edward's remains showed him to be around 6 feet 3 inches tall, which was huge for a 15th century man, and this made him one of history's tallest monarchs. So with regards to what killed Edward IV, we are none the wiser. There are many different proposals put forward, but what it was that led him to live his last 10 days bedbound, and also in a significant degree of discomfort and pain, remains a mystery. Some historians even debate the date of his death, saying he died sooner, but he did die from an unknown illness. It's not believed that he was murdered by poisoning, but more that his debaucherous lifestyle of overeating and drinking, followed by the purging medication he was given, could have caused a significant rupture or injury to his internal organs that caused his death. Edward IV is remembered for being one of the key players of the Wars of the Roses, and certainly one of the winners, as he managed to instill a period of dominance for the House of York. This would only be ended when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III on the battlefield, and began one of history's most infamous eras, the Tudor period. Richard III was crowned king on the 6th of July 1483 at Westminster Abbey, but within 2 years he would be killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. The Wars of the Roses had gripped England for decades before Richard became king. He was sitting following the disappearance and denouncement of the Prince in the Tower at the top of the House of York, which surprised many as he was a brother to the former king Edward IV. Rumours emerged, however, that Richard was responsible for the murder of the true king, the boy Edward V, and through this a rebellion emerged, spearheaded by Henry Tudor. He would later become Henry VII, but despite the rebellion initially not being successful, Henry would try again 2 years later, and together the two met at Bosworth Field. Richard III's defeat at the Battle of Bosworth at the time was shocking. Specifically, who killed the king remains a mystery, but after the incredible discovery of Richard's remains under a car park in Leicester, the final moments of the king's life can be pieced together and told. On the 22nd of August 1485, Richard met Henry Tudor at Bosworth and rode into battle on his white courser horse. He had with him a strong army of around 8,000 soldiers, and the king's army outnumbered Henry's, but the key to the battle was sitting on another hill. Lord Stanley had a private army of 6,000 men, and he was a pivotal player in the battle, as his support meant everything to the two men. Richard III was deployed on Ambion Hill, and Henry on an adjacent hilltop. The battle swayed from side to side until Lord Stanley got involved and ordered his private army to support Henry Tudor, which surprised Richard and his forces. During the final part of the battle, it was said that Richard had Henry Tudor isolated, and that the Royalist army were fighting in the thickest, and the king's men were pressing for victory. Richard was worried about Lord Stanley's betrayal, and he had heard that Henry was situated a large distance from his soldiers, behind them, and was protected by a group of bodyguards. Richard, who was known for being a competent military leader, was confident he could strike the man he deemed to be trying to usurp him, and he led a small detachment of heavy cavalry and charged towards Henry Tudor and his surrounding force. In this attempt to end the battle, Richard was rather successful, and he smashed his way through Henry's guards and killed his standard bearer. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting then took place between the king's small group of charges and Henry's bodyguards, and Lord Stanley, overlooking the battlefield, noticed his stepson Henry was in trouble, and he commanded his soldiers to Richard III's position. It was noted how Richard fought bravely and valiantly, and allegedly even came within a sword's length of Henry Tudor. However, this is where things drastically changed. Richard found himself very overwhelmed by Stanley's mercenaries, who charged towards him, attacking his small force. It is disputed what happened next to Richard, but many agree that the king found himself in very marshy ground, and he and his horse became bogged down in the terrain, and the king was unhorsed. A Burgundian chronicler wrote how Richard's horse leapt into a marsh, and it could not get itself out from it. Shortly after Richard was unhorsed, his final moments came. Famously, Shakespeare writes how he cried out, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." It was stated how the death blow was struck by a Welshman with a halberd, whilst Richard's horse was stuck, and it was said that the blow was so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. The man who killed Richard has been suggested to have been Rhys ap Thomas, a leading Welsh Lancastrian, who shaved part of the king's head with the blow which he struck him. Henry VII's official historian stated how Richard died alone fighting bravely in the thickest press of his enemies, and another account says how he fell in the field, struck by many mortal wounds, with another account suggesting that they beat his head until the brain came out with blood, They never left him until he was dead. The true brutality of the final moments of King Richard III were confirmed when his body and remains were discovered in 2013 following identification. The wounds on the body suggested that Richard's death was in fact very bloody, with 11 wounds being visible on the remains, and 8 of these were to the skull. These had been sustained during battle, which leads us to believe that Richard lost his helmet during the Battle of Bosworth. These wounds were sustained for a frenzied attack by more than one person, piling on the king as he came under pressure on the muddy battlefield. There was a narrow V-shaped cut found along the bottom right side of the lower jaw, suggesting that his face was cut by a dagger or knife or a small blade. There was another cut on his lower jaw, which could have been done by a blade which was thrust up inside of his helmet to slice the strap off, to take off the king's protection to his head. His body was relatively well protected when he died, and so were no visible signs of injury to his torso, meaning that the chances are the king had significant and effective amounts of plate armour on, and when he died he was wearing this. There were also 3 glancing blows caused by a sharp blade such as a poleaxe or a sword on the scalp that shaved the bone. 2 wounds were found on the left side above the ear and 1 on the top, but these wounds would not have been immediately fatal. They were all caused by the same weapon as well. On top of the skull was a small piercing hole, which was caused by a weapon delivered to the king from above, and this could have been dealt by the spike of a poleaxe or a rondel dagger. The aim of this was to drive a hole into the king's skull, inflicting damage to his brain. At the base of Richard's skull, there were 2 significant wounds found which caused damage to the top of the vertebrae, and this was caused by a blade that entered the king's head and sliced through his brain, and it was done so hard that it struck the other side of the skull. These massive wounds were likely to have been fatal and were inflicted by a weapon such as a halberd, sword or a bill. This blow would have been savage and was done with such brutality that it passed through the king's brain, and it was this wound that likely killed Richard. This wound would have been enough on its own to have killed the king. There were other wounds found to his body. For example, one was delivered as a blow from behind with a dagger, which damaged his 10th rib, and another scraped the pelvis and was delivered into the king's right buttocks, which could have also been fatal. But it's believed this was done after death to shame the king, as his armour would have protected this area during battle. Richard's remains were able to tell the world the definitive story as to what happened to the king in his final moments. As Richard was unhorsed with his horse being stuck in the mud, he was forced to dismount, and at some point he lost or removed his helmet, leaving him very vulnerable. He was surrounded by a number of skilled soldiers with medieval weapons, and despite being protected by his own men, when Lord Stanley's men went for the king, Richard's men were quickly overwhelmed. He was attacked by a number of soldiers who thrust their swords and daggers towards him, but a crushing blow from a halberd or a bill stopped the king in his tracks. Richard stood no chance against all of the men intent on killing him, and with the strike from the halberd, the king was killed, and the reign of the Tudor dynasty began shortly after. Richard III's face was not mutilated after death to ensure that the population knew that the king was killed. His armour and clothes were taken off, and his naked body was carried to nearby Leicester on a horse, being displayed in public and exhibited with everyone to see that the king had been slain. It was left on display for 2 days, and was then interred in a plain coffin and tomb inside the low-key Church of the Greyfriars. His burial and body remained lost until 2013, when it was discovered and DNA testing put the remains beyond any doubt that they did in fact belong to King Richard III. With the death of Richard III, one of the most famous royal families in English history came onto the throne, the Tudors. The Tudors were known for their brutality, but Richard III was a king who was also cut from the same cloth. He would do anything to become king, but it's believed that during the Battle of Bosworth Field he fought bravely and valiantly, something that Henry VII's own historian confirmed, and Henry wanted to preserve this. His death was incredibly brutal, and the final moments of Richard III show how tough and bloodthirsty the final moments of the Wars of the Roses really were. Henry VII was declared king by the right of conquest, and he married Elizabeth of York with the hope of uniting the warring Yorkist and Lancastrian factions of the Plantagenet dynastic disputes. He was considered successful in this, and he took steps even after the Battle of Bosworth to ensure that rebellions did not become significant. He did face a number of them initially, including one, which the pretender Lambert Simnel claimed to have been Edward of Warwick. His rebellion was put down, and Henry, in a show of clemency, allowed Simnel to work inside the royal kitchens after, placing him in charge of roasting meat on a spit. Perkin Warbeck's rebellion came in 1490, when he claimed to have been Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince in the Tower, but Henry VII put this rebellion down also, and had Warbeck executed. Through a number of executions, including that of William Stanley's, the Chamberlain of the household, Henry showed the country he was not willing to be messed with. He was a king ultimately that had little experience in running lands and overseeing them, but during his reign he became known for being a wealthy king who was prudent and made the monarchy richer. He kept a close eye over the country's wealth and did impose a number of taxes. The increase in tax and the ruthlessness in which it was collected did affect his popularity inside of England. In terms of his foreign policy, he sought to maintain peace following the Wars of the Roses in England and to make money. He signed a treaty with France that brought wealth to England and importantly stated that France would not support any more pretenders claiming to take the throne. Henry did invade Brittany in November 1492, as he wished to keep it from the French, as they had recently signed an agreement and alliance with Spain that he deemed to be dangerous. He built up his navy for this, and he realised the importance and danger of the Spanish kingdom. He also formed an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. He was shrewd along with his advisors around trade, and through major industries such as wool and cloth, England became a rather prosperous nation. English cloth during his reign began to become traded in different places. To secure his power further, he used justices of the peace on a big scale, and their job was to ensure that the country's laws were being adhered to. The Court of the Star Chamber was also used to allow Henry to deal with disputes and issues quickly, and he dealt with threats to his own power swiftly through this. Justices of the peace were seen as key law enforcers for Henry VII, and despite being unpaid, they were successful and efficient. So overall, during his reign, Henry VII did have a significant degree of positive things to ensure that the monarchy was much more stable than it was during the Wars of the Roses. However, in 1502, tragedy struck the royal family. Henry VII and Elizabeth had a child named Arthur, who was a great hope for the Tudor dynasty. He was their eldest son and was the heir apparent to the throne, and had married Catherine of Aragon, forming an alliance between England and the emerging and feared Spanish. However, shortly after the marriage, Arthur was taken ill, and at Ludlow Castle he died from a viral illness known as the sweating sickness. This devastated the king, and he was regarded as a reserved man who rarely showed any emotion in public. However, he was overcome by immense grief and upset. He was known to have been sobbing uncontrollably at court, and the death of Arthur shattered him greatly. But a year later, further upset for the king came, as his Queen Elizabeth of York passed away, and he shut himself away following this for a number of days and refused to speak to anyone. Henry was completely devastated by the loss of Elizabeth, and her death caused him great heartbreak. Following her death, he considered remarrying, but nothing came to anything. He considered marriage to renew alliances with Spain, but through the negotiations for Catherine of Aragon to marry his other son Henry, the future Henry VIII, this was seen as sufficient. He did take an interest in Johanna of Naples, but this never came to anything. After Elizabeth's death, Henry himself became very ill and nearly died from an unknown illness, but he did recover. He remained ill for a number of years, and in his final years it was noted how his sickness increased daily more and more. Between February and March 1508, Henry suffered from gout, and it was said he was in the very last stages of consumption in July 1508. A month later it was reported that Henry was very ill in extremis, and that he was very ill with little hope of recovery. By the end of March 1509, Henry must have known that his death was coming soon, and he made his last will and testament. It's believed that the decline in his health was made quicker by the death of Elizabeth and Arthur, and his mood became very depressed after these. Other veterans of his campaign against Richard III had passed away, and he made arrangements for a seamless transition of power to his son Prince Henry. Accounts of Henry VII's death came mostly from Bishop John Fisher, who had a sermon on the 10th of May 1509, shortly after the event. He said how 2 nights before the king's death he became so weak that he could not hear mass at the altar, and had struggled for some time to eat and drink. However, he was keen to do his religious duty, and he summoned his confessor to his bedside to hear the sacrament. Mass at his bedside was heard, and it was said to have been a very moving spectacle. It was said that those who witnessed Henry receiving the sacrament were moved with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that sometimes they wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. An image of the proceedings shortly before the king's death shows him attended on by a number of his closest courtiers and most intimate members of his household. Shortly after hearing the religious blessing, Henry managed to cling on to life for another 48 hours. On the day of his death, he heard Mass again, and this time held the crucifix a number of times with great reverence, embracing it tenderly and kissing it. He was in a significant amount of pain and was suffering and was scared, and he in his final moments appealed to Jesus to deliver his soul and to protect him. It was said he claimed, "O my blessed Jesus, O my Lord, deliver my soul from the misery of this world, deliver my soul from these deadly pains, deliver my soul from this corruptible body." In his final moments, the king's son, Prince Henry, who was just 17 at the time, was summoned to his father's bedside for his final instructions, and the king said, "Fatherly and godly exhortations committed unto him, the laborious governance of this realm of England." The king passed away, surrounded by his closest advisers, with William Fitzwilliam, the gentleman usher of Henry's office, being responsible for closing the king's eyes after death. Inside of his bedchamber in Richmond Palace, on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII died from what it's believed to have been tuberculosis at the age of 52. He was buried in the chapel he commissioned to be built, Henry VII's Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, and was laid to rest alongside his wife, Elizabeth of York. It was clear in his final days Henry VII knew what was coming. He ultimately knew what he was facing, and he decided to end his days in pious prayer and repentance for any sins he had committed. Inside of Richmond Palace, he was not alone, being attended on by his closest advisers and friends. It was his son who would take the throne and become Henry VIII, and his reign in particular is known for brutality and turmoil. Henry VII sought to bring an end to the turbulent nature of the time, but Henry VIII, his successor, ripped up all of the work his father had done, and changed the face of English history forever, dividing his nation further by religion. In fact, Henry VIII drove as big a wedge through the population by his religious reforms as the War of the Roses ever did. Henry VIII is mostly associated today for having 6 wives, but during his life he did face a number of serious bouts of illness and disease. When he was 23, he contracted smallpox, a deadly disease which was incredibly serious. However, he managed to recover over time, and then at the age of 30 he contracted malaria, which also made him sick for a while. It was 3 years later that one of the most worrying parts of Henry VIII's life came, when he was involved in a famous and hard-hitting jousting accident that caused him great discomfort and pain throughout the rest of his life. It's believed by some historians that this accident changed the king completely, and that his former self as a positive and happy king transformed into a depressed, short-tempered and bitter one. During a jousting match with the Duke of Suffolk, Henry was hit hard above his right eye by a lance, forcing him off his horse and onto the floor. After this he suffered badly with migraines, and at the age of 45 he was involved in yet another serious jousting accident. He fell from his horse, and after this was trapped by the animal, and was squashed by the horse and also the weight of his armour. This particular incident left him unconscious for at least 2 hours, and many were very worried. When he finally came around, It was said later that the king had changed even further. It's believed that this caused his mood swings, and that he possibly on the tilt yard suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury. Today he would have been diagnosed with this, but following this the king's health declined further. In his final years, Henry began to shun exercise, and he also began to overeat to a huge extent that caused his infamous weight gain. It's considered that he may also have had diabetes and high blood pressure. The king also possibly had varicose ulcers, and the ulcers in his legs would force him to give up sport and exercise, and in his final days servants had to carry him around on a chair as he suffered with movement so much. Obesity also quickened his death, with his overeating a major cause of him dying at the age of 55. Henry VIII passed away on the 28th of January 1547 at the Palace of Whitehall. On the day before his passing, he saw his confessor and priest and was given Holy Communion. Those people who attended on the king and visited him knew that death would soon be on the horizon for the monarch, and the royal doctors, knowing his feared reputation, refused to tell this to Henry. Telling the king he was about to die was treason, and predicting that he would die also was treason, meaning that in one last act of brutality from his deathbed, the king could possibly have sentenced even one of his doctors to their deaths. They knew about his reputation and refused to be honest with the King of England. It was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and a well-liked attendant of the king, Sir Anthony Denny, who was left to tell the king of his impending fate. On the 27th of January, a day before his death, he told the king that, in man's judgment, you are not like to live, and that the king should remember his sins as every good Christian man should do. Henry seemingly accepted his fate and said, "The mercy of Christ is able to pardon me of all my sins, yes, though they be greater than they be." Whilst on his deathbed, it's thought that Henry had the realisation that he had committed a number of great sins during his lifetime. He was a man who had ordered the executions of some of his closest friends, and even two of his own wives. Anne Boleyn, for example, today, is seen as a victim of the barbaric king and his close advisor and friend Thomas Cromwell. Because of Henry's frustration at Anne's inability to give him a son that he greatly wanted, his attention switched to another woman, Jane Seymour. But Henry needed a way out of his marriage, and he ordered Cromwell to find him one, and Cromwell orchestrated an intricate web of lies that placed the Queen accused of treason, incest and adultery. And with this scheming, the King and Cromwell had in a sense an innocent woman's head struck from her body, having Anne Boleyn executed. The execution of Anne Boleyn was just one of many sins the brutal king had committed, and there was a long line of them. The huge scores of those executed within his kingdom placed around 3% of the total population executed during Henry's reign, which is a colossal amount, showing the true scale of his bloody reign. He had ordered his last high-profile execution just a week earlier, having Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, killed for treason. On his deathbed, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to hear the king's last wishes and to pray for him. His close friend Anthony Denny was ordered to get Cranmer to be with him, and Henry then went into a deep sleep. Cranmer was sent, and it took him hours to be by the king's side due to the treacherous and icy conditions, and he arrived around midnight on the 28th of January. He then went to the king's bedside, but Henry was in his final hours of life, and wasn't talking, and was struggling to stay conscious. The final moments of Henry VIII's life have been stated as, at the end there was no master and servant, no prince and churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity. Cranmer begged Henry to give him a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response he felt a grip of his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayers, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Cranmer would be glad of that. Around 2 a.m. the king passed away. His exact cause of death isn't completely clear, and it's believed that it could have been a pulmonary embolism or renal and liver failure that killed him. The history books have been written stating that the king did die from natural causes. For 2 days after his death, his body lay in a chamber undisturbed, and his death was kept a secret even to his household staff, who were still preparing meals to be brought to his chamber for 2 days. On the morning of the 31st of January 1547, the Lord Chancellor, announced the king's death to Parliament in tears, and then Henry's son Edward was proclaimed King Edward VI and was taken to the Tower of London to await his coronation. Over the next few days, Henry's body was embalmed and encased in lead, and was surrounded by burning tapers as it laid in state inside the presence chamber at Whitehall. It was then moved to the chapel, and across the country the bells of churches tolled in memory for their dead king. On the 14th of February 1547, Henry VIII's body was taken from Whitehall to Windsor Castle. The coffin was rather large, and it was covered in blue velvet and cloth of gold, and was laid down on a chariot. This was drawn by black horses, who took it along the roads that had been prepared for the procession of the king's final journey. On the coffin was a wax effigy of the king, and on top was a crown and a nightcap of black satin filled with precious stones. The procession stopped overnight at Sion Abbey, before the next day heading to Windsor. It was said here that the remains of the king exploded, but then the journey to Windsor continued the next day. It took 16 strong yeomen of the guard to carry Henry's coffin into the church, and to lower it into the vault of the choir of St George's Chapel, with the king laid to rest next to Jane Seymour, his third wife and mother to Edward VI. Following the funeral ceremony, the chief officers of the household broke their white staves of office and threw them into the vault after the coffin, showing that their roles serving their master had come to an end. It was planned for Henry to be buried in a huge Renaissance coffin that he had taken from Cardinal Wolsey following his death in Leicester, but the work was not completed. His sarcophagus does survive, but today it's the base of Lord Nelson's tomb in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral. Henry VIII lies today under a simple and low-key 19th century black marble floor slab that reads, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII 1537 and King Henry VIII 1547. He is interred in the same vault as Charles I's remains, the king who was beheaded following the English Civil War, and also one of Queen Anne's children, who died in infancy." King Henry VIII is considered to have been one of the most notorious monarchs in history, with his bloodthirsty temper and brutal outbursts of anger that resulted in bloody acts. But his death was met with relative peace and quiet, tended to by only a few close people and the Archbishop of Canterbury. His death did not echo the turbulent nature of his reign, for example the political changes, marriages and religious reforms he brought to the country. He was a king whose life was compelling, and today he's become a legendary figure of English history. At around 2 a.m. on the 12th of October 1537, inside one of the rooms of Hampton Court Palace, Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, gave birth to a healthy son that was described as the most beautiful boy that ever was seen. This was the moment King Henry VIII had been waiting for. Over 20 years of disappointment had given him in the eyes a legitimate male heir to continue the Tudor dynasty. The king, overjoyed, rode to Hampton Court to meet his son, and across the country there were huge celebrations. 3 days later, inside the chapel of Hampton Court, the christening for the young boy took place, and the child was christened Edward. However, the boy that Henry wished for so much would reign for only 6.5 years, and it would be his shunned half-sister Elizabeth who would become the greatest Tudor monarch of all. Edward spent the early years of his life inside of Hampton Court, but there was great upset following his birth after his mother Jane Seymour passed away. This caused the king to be very distraught, as it's believed Jane passed away from postnatal complications. He was kept at Hampton Court, as it was believed the air was cleaner outside of the centre of London, and he was noted to have been a rather happy and healthy child. His governess wrote, in March 1539, with Edward around 18 months old, that "My Lord Prince is in good health and merry. Would to God the King and your Lordship had seen him last night. The minstrels played, and his Grace danced and played so wantonly that he could not stand still." He was raised amongst women. However, as he reached his 6th birthday, things changed, as the Tudors believed this was the age when a child became an adult. Because of this, Henry VIII ordered that his son's household and apartments should be changed so that they were exactly the same as his, and he ordered huge Flemish tapestries to adorn the walls. Edward's childhood was spent having the finest humanist education in a well-protected environment, and his health was monitored very heavily by the royal doctors who checked up on him. They were very worried about anything that could go wrong, and if Edward did not eat something, it would be noted down. Edward was given a rather rich diet, and it was said that in October 1541 that the prince was handsome and well fed, and also was very tall for his age. It was also said that his posture was a little off, saying his right shoulder was lower than his left, leading to the fact that the young prince may have had scoliosis of the spine. This condition was in the family, as his maternal uncle Edward Seymour did suffer from this. In the very same month, Edward became ill, and suffered with a fever and illness today that would be referred to as malaria. Edward was incredibly sick, and it looked like he was going to die, and this caused great upset to King Henry VIII. He sent his own royal doctor to see Edward, and he visited the prince regularly, and gave him soups and broths and no meat. He was kept on a boring diet of food, and because of this, Edward became annoyed, as he did not have the food he was accustomed to. He even called the doctor a fool, and questioned his skills, but this feistiness was a sign that he was recovering. After 10 days of being gravely ill, he did recover from illness, and then he returned to his carefree lifestyle following this. After the death of King Henry VIII, Edward inherited the throne, becoming king on the 28th of January 1547, and being coronated on the 20th of February. But following becoming king, Edward was stricken by a mysterious illness that confined him to his bed. Again, those who were close to the king did not expect him to survive, and the doctors even decided he was a lost cause. This news was incredibly secret, but Edward within a few weeks had once again recovered, and it was noted he took part in hunts shortly after. But in the spring of 1552, the doctors became concerned yet again, as Edward was sick with smallpox. This was a very deadly disease that was common within Tudor England, and his father and sister, Elizabeth, caught it during their lives but managed to survive. For Edward, though, his fight against smallpox was short-lived, and he recovered rather quickly. When he met with an Italian astrologer in October 1552, it was said how the king was very short-sighted, and also a little deaf, and to read the boy did wear glasses. He was known to have been given eye drops in the form of some mixture also for his eyes. But in December 1552, this is where things went very downhill for King Edward VI. Edward began to show signs he was suffering from tuberculosis, and it's believed that a bout of measles could also have left him immunosuppressed and allowed him to become infected with TB. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was a horrific illness that claimed the lives of many, and it did not discriminate. On the 16th of February 1553, Edward became very sick with a cold that caused a fever. During this time, Princess Mary, his eldest half-sister, came to visit him to reconcile their differences, but Edward was stuck in bed with a horrific cough. There were rumours in the king's household that he could have been poisoned, and there was a lot of secrecy about Edward's illness. A number of people were summoned to visit the king to try and help him, and one woman whose identity was not known said she could cure him, but she did no such thing. She administered a number of potions and ointments that soon made Edward worse and caused his arms and legs to swell. Edward was not looking very well at all, and as March came he remained ill. For around a month he had not left his bedroom, and it was said that to move the king was very dangerous. But he did seem to recover slightly in April, where he enjoyed a number of walks inside of Westminster Park on days where the weather was good, and then he was moved on April the 11th, 1553, to Greenwich Palace to escape the dirty air of central London. He was seen inside the gardens by members of the public the following day, but by this time he was getting worse. His cough was still prominent, and he was coughing up horrific smelling and different coloured liquid. Sometimes it was green or yellow, but in other times it was a colour of blood, showing that Edward's lungs were in great trouble. By May 1553, it was believed that the air would help the king, and the doctors at this time believed he would make a full recovery, but the doctors believed he was suffering from a tumour in his lung. His stomach also swelled, and he began to get bed sores from being in bed for a lot of time. When he met with the French ambassadors on the 17th of May, it was said that the king looked weak, and he coughed throughout the meeting. But by the end of May he was going rapidly downhill, and was given medication to help him sleep. Edward did make arrangements for his succession. He would disinherit his two half-sisters, and name his cousin Lady Jane Grey and her heirs as successors to the throne, to avoid Princess Mary becoming queen and restoring England to Catholicism. On the 10th of June the situation looked bleak, and Edward was given 3 days to live by his doctors. as it was stated that he could not keep anything in his stomach. He was afflicted with a fever that would not break, and on the 15th of June this in particular was very bad. It did go away briefly for 24 hours, but came back 2 days later, and Edward's body was so weak it could not fight the infection or disease. He could not get up, and his legs were incredibly swollen. It was said by the 29th of June Edward had had enough, and 5 days later he could not breathe well, and did not wake up much. It was also said his hair and nails were falling out, and he was covered in scabs. The last few days of the young boy king were incredibly painful, and he was simply just waiting for his death. On the 1st of July 1553, he did appear at windows in the palace to stop people spreading rumours that he had already died, but he was dishevelled and looked a shadow of his former self. Over the next few days more crowds would gather to catch a glimpse of the king, but he did not come out. It was Sir Henry Sidney who remained with King Edward in his final moments. Before Edward could not speak, Sidney told him to pray to God to stop England from returning to Catholicism, and it was noted that he wished his English subjects to die as Protestants. It was said Edward prayed, "Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life, and take me amongst thy chosen. Howbeit not my will, but thy will be done. Lord, I commit thy spirit to thee. O Lord, thou knowest how happy it were for me to be with thee, yet for thy chosen's sake, send me of life and health, that I may serve truly thee. O my Lord God, bless thy people, and save thine inheritance. O Lord God, save thy chosen people of England. O my Lord God, defend this realm from papistry, and maintain thy true religion, that I and my people may praise thy holy name for thy Son Jesus Christ's sake." The Bishop of Ely, Thomas Goodrich, then heard Edward's last confession, and on the 6th of July 1553, between 8 and 9 in the evening, King Edward VI died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. It was said that his last words were, "I am faint, Lord have mercy upon me and take my spirit." Following his death, a surgeon opened up the king's chest and stated that he had died from lung disease, as the lungs had 2 large ulcers and these had turned infected. It's believed that tuberculosis was what caused the king's illness, or that the king suffered from a pulmonary infection which affected his lungs. At the time for this there was no treatment, meaning that the infection would have caused damage to the lungs and caused abscesses. This infection would have wreaked havoc in his body, and septicemia would have caused his organs to shut down. With this we don't know for certain what killed King Edward VI, but it's believed to have been mostly TB, and for this we can agree that Edward's death was incredibly painful. Following his passing, Lady Jane Grey was summoned and declared Queen. However, 9 days later she was deposed by Princess Mary, who became Queen Mary I. Edward was buried inside of Henry VII's Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August 1553. It was said that the procession was led by a great company of mourners, and that the crowds mourned their king greatly. Edward's reign was incredibly short, and was not what his father wished for him when he was born, but it did signal a large amount of change in England. However, he was a sickly young man, and his death at such a young age must have been horrific for the young boy Tudor King of England. Charles I was having a number of issues with Parliament during his reign. They were fierce enemies, and the king believed he had been given a divine right to rule by God, and that no one could challenge him. But Parliament were concerned about a number of policies the king had, and the fact he was spending large amounts of money and making terrible decisions. With this, Parliament quickly seized London, and Charles fled the capital for Hampton Court Palace. But within a few months, in mid-1642, Parliament and the king had begun to arm, and they both raised armies to fight against each other. Negotiations broke down and Charles raised the royal standard in Nottingham, going to war with Parliament. After a number of battles it was clear that things were going poorly for the king, and Parliament managed to seize Charles I. He was held under house arrest and did manage to escape Hampton Court at one point, but he was then quickly arrested again and was held on the Isle of Wight. Charles had no chance of winning the war, and Oliver Cromwell refused any further talks with the king. They regarded as a bloody tyrant, and with this they were acting quickly to secure their own power. Charles I was moved to a number of castles, and was sent to Windsor Castle, where he was indicted for treason, and he was then brought to trial. He was accused of using his own power for his own gain, rather than what was good for his country. It was said that he, for accomplishment of such his designs, and for protecting of himself, and his adherents in his and their wicked practices, to the same ends, have traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, and that wicked design, wars, and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been, and are carried on for the advancement of upholding of the personal interest of will, power, and pretended prerogative to himself and his family against the public interest, common right, liberty, justice, and peace of the people of this nation. It was estimated that around 300,000 people and 6% of the population died during the Civil War, and Parliament thought he was guilty of all treasons, murders, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs to the nation, acted and committed in the said wars, or occasioned thereby. Charles refused to plead and claimed the trial was illegal, and he said, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident, that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against a king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is, that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons, it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power have totally changed the ancient government." He was then removed from the court, and then over the next few days was sentenced to death, and 59 commissioners signed Charles I's death warrant, including Cromwell. Charles I did not have long before his death sentence was carried out, and the execution occurred on the 30th of January 1649. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, and Charles spent his final days praying. He also burned his personal papers and correspondence, and he was allowed to see his two youngest children, Elizabeth and Henry, for one last time. He told Elizabeth to remain Protestant and stay true, and that Henry should not become king if he is approached to do so by Parliament. He split his jewels between his children, and then had a restless last night. He woke up early on the day of his execution, and began to get dressed at 5 a.m. in all black in his blue garter sash. He spent a while getting dressed, and gave further instruction as to what should happen with his final artefacts and possessions. He was given an extra shirt so the crowd would not see him shiver on the cold morning, and at 10 a.m. he was summoned to go to Whitehall for his execution. He drank a glass of wine and ate some bread at noon, but outside the banqueting house a huge crowd had gathered outside the platform where Charles's execution would take place. The scaffold was covered in black material, and the execution block was very low, much lower than a normal block. This was so low that the king would have practically had to lie on the floor for his head to be taken off. At 2 p.m. the king was called to the scaffold, and he emerged through the window of the banqueting house and climbed onto the scaffold. One onlooker stated that it was the saddest sight England ever saw. He looked at the crowd and saw a huge barrier of guards, which would prevent him from being heard if he made a speech, so he spoke to one of his attendants on the scaffold, who recorded his final words. Charles said, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom, as much as whosoever, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having of government by those laws, by which their lives and their goods may be most their own. It is not for them to have a share in government, that is nothing, sirs, appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clearly different things, and therefore until that be done, I mean until the people be put into that liberty which I speak of, certainly they will never enjoy themselves." He also said he would go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown in heaven. He said one final word to an attendant who gave him a silk nightcap to put on so his hair did not trouble the axeman. Charles said, "Remember," before he then laid his neck onto the low block, and then he readied himself. Quickly the executioner then struck, and in one clean blow from the axe, the executioner took his head clean off. The executioner then held up the head of the king to silence, and he did not declare the king as a traitor, and following the execution it's believed there was an audible groan, and that the people who witnessed it were not happy with what happened. The king's head was then dropped into the crowd, and a number of soldiers rushed to it and dipped their handkerchiefs in Charles's blood, and they then cut off his hair. The body was then put into a coffin, and this was covered with black velvet. There are a number of people who are suspected of being the person who executed the king. The most probable candidate for the job was Richard Brandon, who was a common hangman at the time. Giles's execution was done by clearly a man who was very skilled and who had cleanly cut off a number of heads, as he did do a successful job. He also executed other key royalists, but Brandon did refuse that he did this initially, but allegedly confessed to being the executioner of the king on his deathbed. The identity of the executioner and his assistant was kept private, and this was done to protect them, as they believed there would be a significant amount of backlash, and many of the usual axemen inside of the capital refused to do the job of killing the king. Many people in England believed they had killed a martyr and a man who was sent by God to rule over the country. In Europe, many people reacted negatively to the event, and many claimed that Cromwell was nothing but a regicide and a usurper who had committed a heinous act in organising the king's execution. The event today is still seen as rather controversial, and many consider Charles I to have been a victim of Cromwell and the effects of the English Civil War, but others consider him to have been an evil monarch who did nothing but act in his own interests. But the execution of King Charles I has to be one of the most shocking and significant events in English history. The Glorious Revolution, also known as the Bloodless Revolution, resulted in the deposition of King James II and the accession of his daughter Mary II and her husband William III, the Prince of Orange, to become the King and Queen of Britain. James II's overt Catholicism caused chaos across the country and alienated much of his population, and he also changed the rules regarding religion across the country. William of Orange was James's nephew and also his son-in-law, and William was worried at the time about what James was doing to England. There was also concern in the country at the time about the power of France in Europe, and England were not really doing anything about this to challenge it. But then a great European coalition had begun to form to stop any aggression, but it did depend upon England. But William had been in touch with leading English politicians for around a year before, and he was being approached to invade England and to oust James II. A group known as the Immortal Seven sent William an invitation, and the intention was there for William to come to England and to invade and oust the current king. William landed at Brixham on the southwestern coast of England on the 5th of November 1688, and his fleet was larger than the Spanish Armada. Support for James dissolved when William arrived, with many officers defecting from the English army, and James tried to resist the invasion to begin with, but these attempts were futile. Then negotiations were underway. Slowly William advanced to London, collecting support, and James II fled to France, with William III being crowned, alongside his wife Mary II. The revolution had occurred almost without any bloodshed, but there was resistance in Scotland and Ireland. The Jacobites for decades would try to restore James to the throne, and also his heirs, after his death, but William oversaw a number of different military campaigns. But on the 28th of December 1694, Mary II died from smallpox, and this left William to rule alone in the country, with the king greatly mourning his wife. When he was the sole monarch, his popularity did wane and plummet across the country. However, he would rule for around 8 years, until William himself got ill and died. It has been attributed for many centuries that the king died from complications emerging from a fall from a horse, but this has been debated. William III, it's believed, suffered from issues regarding his lungs for some time that may have attributed to his death along with his fall. On the early morning of the 21st of February 1702, whilst riding inside the gardens of Hampton Court Palace, the king fell from his horse after it stumbled upon a molehill, and the king was then thrown violently off his steed. He landed hitting the ground and instantly shattered his collarbone. The fall was so bad that it could have killed him or broken his neck, but he then went straight to the royal doctors, where his collarbone was then set instantly by them. However, after his collarbone had been set, William then demanded that he should be taken to Kensington Palace, which was 12 long miles away. He was taken by carriage ride, which was very rough and would have caused further damage to his injury.
This must have been painful for William III, and the bone then had to be reset again after he arrived at Kensington. But following this, he then went into the King's Gallery, and he sat down and fell asleep by an open window, watching what was going on. It was a cold February afternoon, and William then awoke feverish and feeling rather ill, having sat in the draught for some hours, in a lot of pain. Chances are that the adrenaline from his injury was also wearing off, and over the next few days he continued to get much worse. William III continued to have meetings with his advisers and government, and his favourite remained by his side when he took a turn for the worst in March. At this point the king then asked for his old friend Hans Bentinck, who he had fallen out with, and this man arrived before the king had his final moments. The king's last words were, "I draw towards my end." But at around 8 or 9 in the morning, on the 8th of March 1702, William III died. He was 51 when he had died, but following his death the king's body was then subjected to a post-mortem, which took place 2 days after he died. In attendance were the king's favourite doctors and 4 surgeons, and the post-mortem report said a significant amount of issues happened inside his body. It was said, the thorax or chest, we observed, that the right side of the lungs adhered to, the pleura, and the left much more, from which, until separation, then issued forth a quantity of purulent or frothy serum. The upper lobe on the left side of the lung and the part of the pleura next to it were inflamed to a degree of mortification, and this we look upon as the immediate cause of the king's death. From the ventricles of the heart and the greater blood vessels arising out of them were taken several large, tough, flesh-like substances of kind called polyps. The heart itself was of the smaller size, but firm and strong. It was then concluded that the king died from pneumonia, and that his lungs were in a very bad way. He had suffered throughout his life with chronic asthma, and William, despite falling off the horse, was terribly ill at this time. It was said of his collarbone injury that upon laying bare the right collarbone, we found it had been broken near the shoulder, and well set. Some extravased blood was lodged above and below the fracture. So the bone had been set, and it was actually said that this was healing, but it was from pneumonia that the king succumbed to, and not necessarily the riding accident that he did have. It was certainly not ideal for the king, but it would not have been his explicit cause of death. Following his death, the Jacobites toasted to the mole, saying he was a gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat who led William towards his death. But in the years following his wife's death, the king had ruled alone, and he had been the target of a number of assassination attempts, which were unsuccessful. He knew he was despised as he was a foreign ruler, being a Dutchman sitting on the English throne. He felt more secure with other Dutchmen around him, but this made him even more unpopular. He was also accused of much gossip regarding his love life, and there were a number of rumours spread around court about him. But to those outside of his circle of friends, the king was considered cold and rude, but he was a man who took the death of his queen incredibly hard, and William's death had little impact across the country. He was allegedly buried without any ceremony in the middle of the night in Westminster Abbey, but then Queen Anne came onto the throne. George IV was the eldest son of George III, and it was said that when he was at the age of 17, he had become too fond of women and wine, but his father was not the fondest of his heir. The prince in 1784 met Maria Fitzherbert and married her secretly on the 15th of December 1785. However, this marriage was then declared invalid, as members of the royal family under the age of 25 were forbidden to marry without the consent of their king. But in order to get Parliament to pay his debts, the prince entered a loveless marriage with his cousin Caroline, but a few weeks after the birth of their only child, the couple separated and Caroline went on to live in Italy. But as mentioned, in November 1810, George III became unfit to rule. Then afterwards the prince became the regent under the Regency Act 1811. George kept many of his father's ministers, and this benefited England as others were prepared to leave the war with France,
and to allow Napoleon to become the master of Europe. But Britain would triumph over Napoleon in 1815, but when George IV became king, Caroline returned to claim her right as a queen consort. A bill to deprive her of these rights was introduced to the House of Lords, but was never voted on by the Commons. George IV's coronation occurred on the 19th of July 1821, and it was huge and lavish. His crown contained 12,000 diamonds, and 2,000 people attended the coronation banquet. Caroline also showed up, asking to be crowned, but she was refused entry. He was not enamoured by his prime ministers, and George was considered an intellectual and also a key fan of the arts. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which was designed like a Mughal palace, and he also restored much of Windsor Castle. But George had ruled as regent from 1811, and then was just king for around 10 years until he died in 1830. His reputation across the country was mixed. As one writer wrote of his death, there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow low creatures than this deceased king, but those who knew him liked him. But throughout his life, George had been known for loving food and wine, and he had huge banquets. But this led to him becoming rather large, and he then developed gout. Paintings made of him were much more flattering than what was reality, and Queen Victoria would later say of her uncle that his face was covered with grease. However, his last years were characterised by poor health, including conditions such as rheumatism, dropsy, and the hardening of his arteries. He may have also been suffering from the onset of dementia, but George lived his final years inside the privacy of Windsor Castle, and he was known to have spent days on end in bed, and he also suffered from breathlessness, which left him half asphyxiated. By 1827, George was being carried around up and down the stairs, and was wheeled around in a wheelchair, and he became even more reclusive. There were great efforts made to stop people seeing the king in this state, being carried to his carriage, and he spent the last few years of his life at Windsor. George, it's believed, also became blind in one eye, and he took medication for his bladder pain, and he spent a lot of his time drugged up. He then, by spring of 1830, became very unwell. One witness referred to him as blind as a beetle, and he was forced to stamp legislation with his signature, and he did not know what he was signing for. His weight at this time was around 20 stone, and the attacks of breathlessness continued, and he was forced to sleep upright in a chair, and the doctor had to drain fluid from his abdomen. But the king did still want to live, and he had a huge appetite. For breakfast it was said he had a pigeon and beef steak pie, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port and a glass of brandy, followed by medication and sedatives. It was also said that His Majesty's constitution is a gigantic one, and his elasticity under the most severe pressure exceeds what I have ever witnessed. George then dictated his will, and in his final months he became very devoted and devoted to his faith, and confessed that he regretted his miserable life, but wanted mercy and death to be shown upon him. He was at this point unable to lie down, and then he caught a cough which caused further problems, but then he said in private that things are coming to a conclusion. I shall be released about Monday. On the evening of the 25th of June 1830, the king was seriously ill, and he was asleep in a specially fitted chair, and he leaned onto the table in front of him and rested his forehead on one hand. His physician and doctor had been sent away for the evening, and his close friend, Sir Jonathan Wathen Waller, sat with him holding his hand, as the king wanted constant reassurance. At 1:45 a.m, he awoke and asked for medicine before he fell asleep, and then at 3 a.m, he woke again asking for his night chair. The king felt very faint and asked for the windows to be opened, and then the doctor was summoned. The king exclaimed, "My dear boy, this is death." George closed his eyes and lay back then in his chair. He had passed a very bad bowel movement tinted with blood, and this caused great worry with the doctors. But then at 3:15 a.m, George IV died. An autopsy of King George IV showed that he had died from upper gastrointestinal bleeding, following the rupture of a blood vessel in his stomach,
and there was also a large tumour the size of an orange found on his bladder. Also his heart was enlarged, and his valves had hardened and become blocked. He was then buried in St George's Chapel, inside of Windsor Castle, the home he greatly loved. George IV was then succeeded by his brother, William IV. But George IV was a king who drank and ate to excess a huge amount, and he put on a lot of weight throughout his life. Many of his portraits show him standing proudly looking slender, but this was not the case, and he was a king who stepped in a number of times to help his father rule, who was not capable. But George suffered throughout his life with his own problems regarding his health, and at the end of his life, he spent the last of his days living reclusely inside Windsor Castle. He is laid to rest today in the royal vaults with many other monarchs, including the recently deceased Elizabeth II. Following the abdication of his brother, George VI, who was also known as Bertie, became the reluctant king. He was born with the name Albert, and many across the country believed that he would be physically and psychologically incapable of ruling strongly over the nation, and this gossip did spread across the country. But he would prove his dissenters wrong. His coronation took place on the 12th of May 1937, which was the day that Edward VIII was intended to be crowned, but at the time things in Europe were beginning to look rather dire. Nazism was spreading across Germany, and Hitler had seized control, and to many it seemed obvious that the dictator of Germany would begin a war as he sought to take more land. Initially, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain would favour a policy of appeasing Hitler, granting him some territorial gain to keep him quiet, but this was unpopular. George VI went on a tour in 1939 of Canada and America, and it was intended that the visit would be an enthusiastic visit, bonding the two nations and Britain, and with the likelihood of war coming on the horizon, it was seen as a popular thing. At this time, the King and his Queen Elizabeth formed a strong friendship with the President of America, Roosevelt. But as the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth declared war on Nazi Germany. The King, who suffered with a stammer, would make a number of key radio broadcasts, and this would be seen as a defiant symbol against Hitler and hatred. He refused to flee the country during the conflict and would spend most of his time in Buckingham Palace, as well as staying in Windsor Castle in the evening. As the Blitz came to the country, with the German Luftwaffe carrying out bombing raids, the King and Queen almost were hit when 2 German bombs exploded in the courtyard at Buckingham Palace whilst they were there. The Queen said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel like we can look the East End in the face." The royal family were living along with the people who were suffering, and they lived in line with rationing. George's brother was also killed on active service, but when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, the pair would form a close personal relationship, and every Tuesday, for 4.5 years, the pair would meet for lunch to discuss the war effort in secrecy and honesty. The King would regularly during the conflict visit the soldiers, and would visit bomb sites inside of England, paying his respects, and also would be seen near the front line. His visits on ships to sailors and other aspects of the military were seen as a great morale boost for the men. In December 1939, he visited the military in France across the English Channel, and then went on during the conflict to visit places such as North Africa, Malta, Normandy and southern Italy. His visits were seen as the embodiment of determination, and his good nature and positivity was captured in newsreels and shown back home. When the war was won, the huge scenes in London on VE Day were a spectacle which have gone down in history as some of the most joyous. The crowds would shout for their king, crying, "We want the king," and the king along with Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony, and the crowd went wild. King George would also see much of the dissolution of the British Empire, and he would continue to go on different visits around the world. However, it was clear that the Second World War had caused a significant amount of stress, which impacted the health of King George VI. He was also a very heavy smoker, and because of this developed lung cancer, and also the walls of his arteries thickened. The king suffered with a blockage in his arteries in his right leg, and because of this had to cancel a tour to Australia and New Zealand, and he could have lost his leg, but was treated in March 1949. As his health became worse and deteriorated, his daughter Elizabeth, our current queen, began to take on more responsibilities alongside her husband Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. In May 1951, George VI was well enough to attend the Festival of Britain. However, weeks later it was announced that the king would need 4 weeks of rest and relaxation. It was clear that the king was ill, and on the 23rd of September 1951, he had a surgery which removed his left lung as a tumour had been found. He would never fully recover from this operation. The following month his daughter would complete a long tour of Canada, and then at the state opening of Parliament in November 1951, the King's speech was read for him by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Simonds. The traditional Christmas broadcast was spoken by George, but as he was weak, it was recorded in different sections and was then edited together. The final time that King George VI would be seen in public was when he defied the advice of his doctors and family, when he went to London Airport to see off his daughter Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip on their tour to Australia. They would go via Kenya, but this was the last time that she would see her father alive. 6 days later, inside of Sandringham House in Norfolk at 7:30 AM on the 6th of February 1952, King George VI was found dead in his bed. In the night he had died from coronary thrombosis, and that a blood clot had stopped his heart. Princess Elizabeth was told of her father's death by her husband, and she spent an hour alone before she flew back to be with her family and arrived as Queen Elizabeth II. Following George's death, the coffin was laid to rest for 2 days in St Mary Magdalene's Church at Sandringham, and then lay in state at Westminster Hall. His funeral was a huge spectacle that took place at St George's Chapel in Windsor, and there was a huge amount of public mourning for their beloved king. Ultimately, it was the stress of war and also the fact that King George VI was a heavy smoker that made his health deteriorate. He died at the age of 56, which was considered very young for a man who had the best healthcare in the country. He would never recover from his lung operation and was plagued with smoking-related health problems in the final years of his reign. He was a king, beloved by his nation.